Richard Trenton Chase. When Sacramento police finally stepped inside Richard Chase's apartment in January of 1978, the scene defied anything in their training. There were 3 blenders on the counter, all containing blood, body parts in the refrigerator, a calendar on the wall with the word "Today" written on specific dates, each one corresponding to a day someone in the city had been found dead. What nobody knew at the time was that Chase had been walking through the neighborhood for weeks, quietly trying the front doors of houses up and down the street. If a door was locked, he moved on. If it was unlocked, he took that as an invitation. It was 1977, and Chase was a 27-year-old living alone in Sacramento with a history that should have kept him institutionalized. He had been hospitalized in the mid-70s after being found naked and covered in cow's blood near Lake Tahoe. Staff at the psychiatric facility had nicknamed him Dracula. He suffered from severe paranoid schizophrenia and genuinely believed that his blood was turning to powder, that Nazi UFOs were shrinking his heart, and that the only way to stay alive was to consume the blood of others. Despite all of this, he was released, and he stopped taking his antipsychotic medication almost immediately. On December 29, 1977, Chase took the life of 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin in a drive-by shooting while Griffin was carrying groceries into his home. There was no motive, no connection, nothing. Less than a month later, on January 23rd, Chase walked into the unlocked home of 22-year-old Teresa Wallen, who was 3 months pregnant. He ended her life with a gunshot, then mutilated her body and drank her blood from a yogurt cup found in the kitchen. 4 days after that, he entered the home of 38-year-old Evelyn Merath, where he took the lives of Evelyn, her 6-year-old son Jason, her friend Daniel Meredith, and abducted Evelyn's 22-month-old nephew David, whose remains were later recovered at a church parking lot. In total, 6 lives lost in roughly 1 month. The investigation was led by Sacramento detective Ray Biondi, alongside FBI profilers Robert Ressler and Russell Vorpagel from the Behavioral Science Unit. The profile they built became a landmark document. Ressler later wrote extensively about the case, describing Chase as the most clear-cut example of a disorganized offender the Bureau had ever encountered. The crime scenes were frenzied, unplanned, and left enormous amounts of evidence behind. The killer was clearly operating under delusion rather than strategy, which told investigators they were looking for someone with a known psychiatric history living close to the crime scenes. But the break came from something far simpler than criminal profiling. A former high school classmate named Nancy Holder spotted Chase at a shopping center, still wearing a blood-stained orange parka, and called in a tip. That tip led directly to his arrest. Inside the apartment, police recovered a .22 caliber pistol that was ballistically matched to both the Griffin and Merath scenes. The evidence was overwhelming. Chase was indicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder, and his trial began in January of 1979 in San Mateo County after a venue change. On May 8th, the jury found him guilty on all 6 counts and rejected his insanity defense, declaring him legally sane. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin. There is a reason this story is still talked about today, and it has nothing to do with the verdict. Other inmates on death row reportedly urged Chase to take his own life. On December 26, 1980, at the age of 30, he was found dead in his cell from an overdose of stockpiled antidepressants. His case remains a foundational FBI study in psychosis-driven serial violence, and it reshaped how criminal profiling was taught for decades after. As of 2025, Chase has been dead for over 44 years. But his case still appears in FBI training materials as a textbook example of what happens when the mental health system fails at the most basic level. Someone saw what Chase was becoming: the hospitals, the blood, the delusions. But nobody acted in time, and 6 people paid for that failure with their lives. Meanwhile, in a quiet Connecticut suburb, someone else was watching. And this time, the warning signs came from a completely different direction. The Petit family. 12 years before Jennifer Hawk Petit became a name attached to one of the most devastating home invasions in American history. She was a registered nurse and co-director of the health center at the Cheshire Academy. Her husband, William, was an endocrinologist with a practice in the community. Their oldest daughter, Haley, had just graduated from Miss Porter's school and was heading to Dartmouth in the fall. Their youngest, Michaela, was 11, and by all accounts, a bright, gentle kid who loved animals. That was July of 2007. By the morning of July 23rd, Jennifer, Haley, and Michaela would all be gone. The men responsible were Stephen Hayes and Joshua Komisarjevsky, two paroled burglars who had met at a halfway house. Komisarjevsky had roughly 30 prior arrests. Hayes had a long record of his own. On the evening of July 22nd, Komisarjevsky followed Jennifer and Michaela home from a Stop and Shop supermarket, surveilling the house and identifying it as a target. In the early hours of July the 23rd, the two men broke in. They bludgeoned Dr. Petit with a baseball bat and restrained him in the basement. Both daughters were confined upstairs and unable to leave. Over the course of roughly 7 hours, the intruders subjected the family to an ordeal that investigators would later describe as among the worst they had ever encountered. At 9:21 that morning, they forced Jennifer to drive to a Bank of America branch and withdraw $15,000. At the bank, Jennifer quietly alerted a teller, telling her that her family was being held hostage at home. The teller called 911. Police responded and established a perimeter around the Petit home. But what happened next became a point of intense public scrutiny. Officers waited outside while the situation inside the house deteriorated. By the time they entered, Jennifer had been strangled. The house had been doused in gasoline and set on fire. Haley and Michaela, unable to escape their rooms, died from smoke inhalation. Dr. Petit managed to get out through a basement bulkhead. He was the sole survivor. Both suspects fled in the family's vehicle and were captured immediately after crashing into police cruisers at the end of the driveway. Now, this is where things took years to resolve. Hayes and Komisarjevsky were tried separately, each trial lasting weeks and drawing national media attention. The evidence was staggering in scope. Cell phone records, bank surveillance footage, DNA evidence, and the testimony of Dr. Petit himself all pointed to both men with no ambiguity. Hayes was convicted in October of 2010 on 16 of 17 counts, including 6 capital felony charges, and sentenced to death plus 106 years. Komisarjevsky was convicted in October of 2011 and sentenced to 6 death sentences plus 140 years. But Connecticut abolished the death penalty in 2012, and in August of 2015, the state Supreme Court ruled in a case called State versus Santiago that the abolition applied retroactively. Both men were sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The legal aftermath stretched out for over a decade. Komisarjevsky filed a final direct appeal, which the Connecticut Supreme Court rejected unanimously, 7-0, in April of 2021. An Oregon judge denied Hayes' petition for a formal name and sex change in February of 2024 on public interest grounds. As of 2025, both men remain behind bars for life. Hayes, who has since come out as a transgender woman and legally changed her name to Linda Mai Lee, was transferred via interstate compact to the Oregon State Penitentiary in March of 2023. Komisarjevsky, 44 years old in 2025, remains in a Connecticut facility. Dr. William Petit went on to be elected to the Connecticut General Assembly. The case directly caused Governor Jody Rell to veto a 2009 death penalty repeal bill and led to tougher home invasion and persistent offender statutes across the state. That is not a typo, by the way. The two men who did this were already known to the system. They were parolees, They had met in the very halfway house that was supposed to be rehabilitating them. Not every monster hides in the shadows of a city. Sometimes they build a compound in rural America and convince their followers that God speaks through them. James Thim, Rouleau, Nebraska, 1985. A hog farm owned by a widower named Rick Stice had become something else entirely. Over the span of roughly 2 years, an unemployed truck driver named Michael Wayne Ryan had transformed the property into an armed compound, stockpiling stolen farm equipment, automatic weapons, and over 150,000 rounds of ammunition. Ryan had been radicalized through posse comitatus and Christian identity teachings he picked up from a preacher named James Wickstrom in Hiawatha, Kansas, and he claimed to be the Archangel Michael, communicating directly with God through something he called an arm test. He would hold out his arm, ask a yes or no question, and claim that God was answering through the movement. Whatever Ryan wanted to do, the arm test confirmed it. Around 20 followers lived on the property under his absolute control. The first victim was Rick Stice's own son, a young child whom Ryan had declared a mongrel and the seed of Satan. Around March 25, 1985, Ryan harmed the boy fatally. The child's body was buried in an unmarked grave on the farm, and nobody outside the compound said a word. Rick Stice, the boy's own father, had been so thoroughly broken by Ryan's psychological dominance that he did not resist or flee. He had been reduced to the same slave status that would soon be imposed on the next victim. The second victim was James Thim, a 26-year-old follower who had joined the group believing in its mission and who had been demoted to what Ryan called slave status alongside Stice for the crime of expressing doubt. Between approximately April 27th and April 30th of 1985, Thim was chained in a hog shed and subjected to 3 days of systematic torture. He was beaten, whipped, shot in the fingertips, partially skinned alive, and had his legs broken. Other cult members participated in or witnessed the abuse under Ryan's orders. Ryan's 16-year-old son, Dennis, fired the final shot that ended his life. The details presented at trial were so extreme that seasoned investigators later said they had difficulty processing what they had documented. Court filings described the acts as deliberate and premeditated, carried out over days with the full awareness of the entire compound. The unraveling began in June of 1985, when 2 followers, James Haverkamp and John David Andreas, were arrested in Kansas for transporting stolen farm machinery. During questioning, they confessed to what had been happening on the farm. The FBI raided the compound and recovered the ammunition stockpile and over $250,000 in stolen property. Ryan was not arrested on the farm itself. Instead, the Richardson County Sheriff lured him to the station under a pretext, and he was taken into custody without incident. A second raid recovered both bodies from unmarked graves on the property. After a change of venue to Omaha, a jury convicted Michael Ryan in April of 1986 of first-degree murder for the death of James Thim and second-degree murder for the death of the child. He was sentenced to death for Thim and life imprisonment for the second count. Every appeal failed over the next 3 decades, including federal habeas petitions that reached the U.S. Supreme Court, which declined review in January of 2015. Ryan's son, Dennis, was initially sentenced to life for second-degree murder. On retrial, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter and was released in 1997, having served roughly 12 years. Timothy Haverkamp served approximately 24 years before being paroled. James Haverkamp and John David Andreas, the 2 men whose arrest for stolen machinery cracked the case open, were released in 1998. Other followers received varying sentences, with the last of them freed by 2009. As of 2025, Michael Ryan is dead. He died on May 24, 2015, at Tecumseh State Correctional Institution from metastatic carcinoma of the parotid gland at the age of 66. He spent nearly 30 years on Nebraska's death row without ever being executed, making him one of the longest-serving death row inmates in the state's history. The state never set an execution date. In the end, cancer did what the justice system never got around to doing. The same isolation that allowed Ryan to build his compound, that rural distance from oversight and accountability, would prove to be the exact dynamic that let a crime in Austin, Texas go unsolved for nearly a decade. The yogurt shop murders. If you had asked anyone in Austin, Texas about the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop on West Anderson Lane in 1991, they would have told you it was just another place where teenagers worked after school. A normal storefront in a normal shopping center. They had no idea. On the night of December 6th, 1991, the shop was set ablaze around midnight. When firefighters entered the building, they discovered 4 teenage girls inside. All 4 had been harmed fatally before the fire was set. Amy Ayers was 13. Sarah Harbison was 15. Jennifer Harbison and Eliza Thomas were both 17. Jennifer and Eliza had been closing the shop that night. Sarah and Amy had come to get a ride home with them. The fire had been deliberately set to destroy evidence, and it worked. The blaze consumed enormous amounts of physical material that might have led investigators to a suspect. For nearly 8 years, there was nothing. The Austin Police Department followed hundreds of leads, and none of them panned out. The case became one of the most high-profile cold cases in Texas history. Then, in 1999, 4 men who had been teenagers at the time of the crime, Robert Springsteen, Michael Scott, Maurice Pierce, and Forrest Wellborn, were arrested after detectives elicited incriminating statements during prolonged interrogations. Scott was convicted in September of 2002 and sentenced to life. Springsteen was convicted in June of 2001 and sentenced to death, which was later reduced to life because he had been 17 at the time of the offense. But not everyone was convinced. 2 separate grand juries declined to indict Wellborn. Charges against Pierce were dismissed in 2003 after he had already spent more than 3 years behind bars, waiting for a trial that never came. And then the convictions started falling apart. In 2006, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals overturned both Scott's and Springsteen's convictions on Sixth Amendment grounds, ruling that their interlocking confessions had been used against each other in violation of the right to confrontation, as established in the 2004 Crawford v. Washington decision. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to reinstate the convictions in February of 2007. In 2008, YSTR DNA testing revealed an unknown male profile on one of the victims that did not match any of the 4 suspects. That was the moment the case fundamentally changed. The confessions that detectives had spent years building a prosecution around could not explain the DNA. Springsteen and Scott were freed on bond in June of 2009 after a Travis County judge ordered their release, and prosecutors dropped all charges. Pierce died in 2010 during a confrontation with an Austin police officer, never having been convicted or formally cleared. And somehow, it gets worse, because for over 3 decades, the families of those 4 girls had no real answers. 4 young lives taken, years of wrongful prosecution, and still no one could say with certainty who had walked into that yogurt shop and committed those acts. Then, in September of 2025, the Austin Police Department announced that DNA evidence had finally identified the actual perpetrator. His name was Robert Eugene Brashers, a serial offender who had taken his own life during a 1999 standoff with police in Missouri. Brashers had been arrested at an El Paso checkpoint just 2 days after the murders, carrying a pistol that matched the caliber used at the scene. He had been right there, within reach of law enforcement, and nobody connected the dots for over 30 years. On February 19, 2026, a Travis County judge formally exonerated all 4 men, declaring them factually innocent and dismissing all charges with prejudice. Springsteen and Scott are now eligible for up to $80,000 per year of wrongful imprisonment under Texas law. As of 2026, the case that haunted Austin for over 30 years is finally closed. The real perpetrator was identified through DNA, and the men who lost years of their lives to wrongful prosecution were formally cleared. Wellborn is free. Scott and Springsteen are free. Pierce, who never saw his own exoneration, is gone. Up to this point, every case on this list involved a perpetrator who was caught, convicted, or identified eventually. What happened in Wichita, Kansas in December of 2000 was so extreme that even the sole survivor's testimony was almost too much for the courtroom to absorb. The Carr brothers. The engagement ring that Jason Beaufort had hidden inside a popcorn box in his townhouse was meant to be a surprise for his girlfriend Holly. He had planned it carefully, tucked it away where she would never accidentally find it. That ring would later be recovered as evidence in one of the most violent home invasions in Kansas history, because on the night it was discovered, it was found by the men who had broken in to take everything. But first, who these people were. On the night of December 14th, 2005 young friends were gathered at a townhouse on Birchwood Drive in Wichita, Kansas. Jason Beaufort was a 26-year-old high school teacher. Brad Haka, 27, worked as a finance director. Aaron Sander, 29, was a former financial analyst who had left the industry to study for the priesthood. Heather Mueller, 25, was a preschool teacher at St. Thomas Aquinas Catholic School. And Holly Glover, 25, was also a teacher and the woman Jason was planning to propose to. They were young, established, and building their lives in a city where violent crime felt like something that happened somewhere else. Brothers Reginald and Jonathan Carr, career criminals originally from Dodge City, Kansas, with extensive prior records, had already been on a violent spree that week. On December 7th, they had robbed a 23-year-old assistant baseball coach named Andrew Schreiber at gunpoint, forcing him to make ATM withdrawals. On December 11th, they shot 55-year-old Ann Walenta, a cellist with the Wichita Symphony and a librarian, as she sat in her car. She managed to describe her attackers before dying of her wounds 3 days later. On the 14th, they forced their way into the Birchwood Drive townhouse. Over the next several hours, they forced all 5 people to strip. They assaulted both women repeatedly. They forced the victims to perform acts on each other. They drove each person individually to ATMs, withdrawing roughly $2,000 total. They found the engagement ring, and then they loaded all 5 into a vehicle, drove them to a snowy soccer field on the outskirts of the city, forced them to kneel in the freezing open air, and opened fire. Beaufort, Haka, Sander, and Mueller all lost their lives. Holly survived because a plastic hair barrette deflected the bullet from her skull. Wounded, freezing, and unclothed, she walked over a mile through the snow until she reached a stranger's house and got help. The brothers returned to the townhouse afterward and beat Holly's dog to death with a golf club. And no, I am not making that up. Every detail was confirmed at trial through Holly's testimony, DNA evidence, and physical evidence recovered from the scene. The Carr brothers were arrested the very next day after a tip identified Jason Beaufort's truck. Holly's testimony at trial was devastating. Combined with overwhelming DNA and physical evidence recovered from the crime scenes, the ATMs, and the soccer field, the case against both men was airtight. In November of 2002, both were convicted on a combined 113 charges, including capital counts, and both were sentenced to death on November 15th. The appeals process became one of the longest and most complex in Kansas legal history. In 2004, The Kansas Supreme Court briefly invalidated the state's entire death penalty statute in a case called State v. Marsh, but the U.S. Supreme Court reversed that ruling in 2006. In 2014, the Kansas Supreme Court vacated the death sentences again, this time citing improper joint sentencing procedures. In January of 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed again in Kansas v. Carr. An 8-1 opinion written by Justice Antonin Scalia, one of the last major opinions of his career, reinstating both death sentences. In January of 2022, the Kansas Supreme Court issued companion rulings totaling over 200 pages, affirming the death sentences and rejecting all remaining state constitutional challenges. Even after all that, as of 2025, the court was still hearing technical arguments about the specific count numbering on which the death sentences were anchored. As of 2025, Reginald and Jonathan Carr remain on death row at El Dorado Correctional Facility. Kansas has not carried out an execution since 1965, which means both men sit under a sentence that the state has shown no willingness to enforce for over 60 years. Holly Glover married Andrew Schreiber, the same man the Carrs had robbed a week before the home invasion in 2004. The engagement ring that Jason Beaufort had hidden for her was entered into evidence and never returned. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. James Byrd Jr. On the morning of June 7, 1998, a man driving along Huff Creek Road in Jasper, Texas, noticed something on the pavement. Then he noticed something else, and then something else. By the time law enforcement finished processing the scene, they had documented 81 separate locations containing human remains spread over roughly 3 miles of rural road. So how does a 49-year-old man, a father of 3 who grew up in Jasper and was part of the last segregated graduating class at J.H. Rowe High School in 1967, end up scattered across a logging road in the town where he was born? But this story does not start on Huff Creek Road. It starts a few hours earlier, in the early morning darkness, when James Byrd Jr. accepted a ride home from 3 white men in a gray 1982 Ford pickup. The driver was Sean Allen Berry, 23, a local acquaintance. The passengers were Lawrence Russell Brewer, 31, and John William King, 23. Brewer and King were ex-convicts who had been radicalized into the Confederate Knights of America, a white supremacist gang inside the Texas prison system. Instead of driving Byrd home, the 3 men drove to a remote stretch of Huff Creek Road and beat him severely. They chained him by the ankles to the rear bumper of the truck and dragged him approximately 3 miles down the road. Forensic evidence established that Byrd remained conscious during much of the dragging. Investigators found that his skull and brain were intact, his ribs fractured, and abrasion patterns on his body were consistent with him trying to hold his head up off the pavement. He died when his body struck a concrete culvert, which severed his right arm and head. The men then dumped his torso in front of a black cemetery and drove to a barbecue. In a span of roughly 3 miles, they left behind a trail of physical evidence so extensive it took investigators days to process. Along the road, police recovered a wrench with the name Berry engraved on it, and a cigarette lighter inscribed with King's prison nickname, Possum. King's apartment contained white supremacist literature, and both he and Brewer had prison tattoos associated with organized racist groups. Because of the documented white supremacist affiliations of 2 of the perpetrators and the clearly racial nature of the crime, the FBI joined the investigation within 24 hours. All 3 men were arrested within days. They were tried separately in Jasper County. John William King was convicted of capital murder on February 23, 1999, and sentenced to death. Lawrence Russell Brewer was convicted that September and also sentenced to death. Sean Allen Berry was convicted in November and sentenced to life, with parole eligibility in 2038. The jury concluded that Berry participated but did not have the same level of premeditation as Brewer and King. Brewer was executed by lethal injection at Huntsville On September 21, 2011, he was the first white person executed in Texas for taking the life of a black person since Reconstruction. King was executed on April 24, 2019, after the U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal, in which he argued ineffective counsel because his attorneys had conceded his guilt against his wishes during the trial. That argument did not succeed. King maintained his innocence to the end, despite overwhelming physical evidence placing him at the scene. As of 2025, Berry remains incarcerated and will not be eligible for parole until 2038. The crime prompted Texas to pass the James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Act in 2001. In October of 2009, President Obama signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, expanding federal hate crime protections to include sexual orientation, gender identity, and disability. Jasper itself tore down the wrought iron fence that had segregated the city cemetery since 1836. That fence came down in January of 1999, 7 months after Byrd's death. A man accepts a ride home and never arrives. A town tears down a fence that should have come down a century earlier. In some way, every detail about this case folds back on the same question of what was always there, just beneath the surface. Everything about the Byrd case is defined by what happened on a single stretch of road in East Texas. What follows is defined by the opposite problem entirely. Not too much evidence, but too little. Not one country, but 3. And a perpetrator who simply walked away. Pedro Alonso Lopez. In 1994, a man convicted on 110 counts of taking the lives of young girls across South America was released from an Ecuadorian prison for good behavior. 4 years after that, Colombian authorities set him free on bail, equivalent to roughly $50 American. He was told to report monthly. He never did, and nobody has confirmed a single verified sighting of him since 1999. Everything was in place for Pedro Alonso Lopez to spend the rest of his life behind bars. He had confessed to the deaths of over 300 young girls across Peru, Colombia, and Ecuador. And he had led investigators to mass graves containing between 53 and 57 bodies. But the legal systems of 3 separate countries let him walk, one after the other. Lopez had endured a deeply traumatic childhood in Colombia's Tolima department. His father had been lost during the period of political violence known as La Violencia before Lopez was born, and his mother worked in conditions of extreme poverty. He was removed from his home as a young child and subjected to abuse during his early years, including harm at an American-run orphanage that was supposed to protect him. Imprisoned in Bogotá's La Modelo prison as a young man for car theft, he was assaulted by fellow inmates, and after defending himself fatally against 3 of them in what was ruled self-defense, his sentence was extended only 2 years. After his release around 1978, he began targeting impoverished and indigenous girls across 3 countries. He later told investigators he chose his victims because they were the least likely to be reported missing. And for years, he was right. Entire communities lost children without any coordinated law enforcement response across national borders. He was finally captured in Ambato, Ecuador in March of 1980 after attempting to abduct a young girl from a marketplace. It was not the police who caught him. It was the community, people in the market who saw what was happening and restrained him until authorities arrived. And before that capture, a group of indigenous people in Peru's Ayacucho region had actually detained him and were preparing to carry out their own justice when an American missionary intervened and turned him over to Peruvian authorities. Rather than prosecute him, Peru simply deported him across the border. That decision would prove catastrophic because Lopez continued offending immediately. His confession in Ecuador and the subsequent discovery of mass graves led to his conviction on 110 counts in July of 1981. That number, 110, is the only court-confirmed figure. The 300 he claimed remains uncorroborated by physical evidence. and investigators acknowledge they may never be able to confirm or deny the full scope. The Ecuadorian court sentenced him to 16 years, the maximum the law allowed at the time. There was no life sentence available. There was no mechanism for indefinite detention. After his release and deportation to Colombia, he was indicted for a 1979 case involving a Colombian victim named Flor Alba Sanchez. Colombian authorities declared him mentally unfit and committed him to a psychiatric facility. In February of 1998, after being declared sane, he was released on minimal bail with the condition that he report monthly to authorities. He never reported, not once. His last confirmed sighting was in September of 1999, renewing an identification card in Bogotá. Interpol issued a warrant in 2002 and quietly deactivated it in 2005. A man convicted of 110 deaths, who confessed to 300, was released twice, deported once, and then set free on $50 bail. As of 2025, his whereabouts are completely unknown. He would be 76 or 77 years old. No credible source has confirmed his death, his capture, or a single verified sighting since 1999. He remains one of the most prolific offenders in recorded history, and in all likelihood, the only one of that scale who simply disappeared. 3 separate countries had Lopez in custody at various points, and all 3 let him go. The system did not just fail, it failed repeatedly, across borders, over decades. But in a small Kansas town in 1959, the system worked exactly as it was supposed to. It just needed one inmate to decide to talk. The Clutter Family. 7 years before Truman Capote published In Cold Blood and changed the way Americans consume true crime, the Clutter family of Holcomb, Kansas, was everything a small farming community wanted to be. Herbert Clutter, 48, ran a prosperous wheat operation on the western Kansas plains. His wife Bonnie, 45, had struggled with depression, but was a devoted presence in the household. Their 2 youngest children, Nancy and Kenyon, were both high school students living at home. But in the early hours of November 15, 1959, 2 men entered the Clutter farmhouse looking for a safe that did not exist. Richard Hickok, 28, and Perry Smith, 31, were parolees from the Kansas State Penitentiary. A former cellmate named Floyd Wells, who had once worked as a farmhand for Herb Clutter, had told Hickok about a safe in the house supposedly containing $10,000. There was no safe. There was no $10,000. The men drove over 400 miles based on a rumor from a convict. When they arrived and realized the safe did not exist, they did not leave. Herb and Bonnie Clutter were found in separate parts of the house. Herb had been shot at close range with a 12-gauge shotgun, and his throat had also been cut. Bonnie was found upstairs. Nancy and Kenyon also lost their lives that night. All 4 members of the family were gone. The men left with roughly $40 to $50, a transistor radio, and a pair of binoculars. The investigation was led by Alvin Dewey of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. For weeks, there were no strong leads. The Clutter family had no known enemies. Herb was respected across western Kansas, active in the community, and had no financial disputes that could explain a targeted attack. The absence of a clear motive made the case feel random, and that randomness terrified the region. Neighbors who had never locked their doors started locking them overnight. Then Floyd Wells, sitting in prison and hearing the news of the Clutter family, did something that broke the case wide open. He contacted the warden and named Hickok as the person who had been asking about the Clutter farm and the supposed safe. That tip sent investigators after Hickok and Smith, who were arrested in Las Vegas on December 30th, 1959, while still driving a stolen Iowa car. Inside the vehicle, investigators found boots whose prints matched those recovered from the Clutter basement. Each man blamed the other for pulling the trigger. Smith later said he had done all for himself to spare Hickok's mother the grief of knowing her son had taken a life. Hickok, in a manuscript discovered by the Wall Street Journal in 2017, reportedly contradicted that and placed all responsibility on Smith. The question of who fired which shots has never been definitively resolved. Both men were tried in Finney County District Court. On March 29, 1960, an all-male jury convicted them of first-degree murder after less than an hour of deliberation and recommended death. The case attracted enormous attention, in part because of the absolute randomness of the crime. Two drifters had driven hundreds of miles based on bad information from a fellow inmate, and 4 people were dead because of it. After 5 years of appeals on death row at the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing, both men were hanged on April 14, 1965. Hickok at 12:41 in the morning, Smith at 1:19. As of 2025, both men have been dead for 60 years. In 2012, their bodies were exhumed and DNA tested against evidence from the unsolved 1959 Walker family case in Osprey, Florida, where 4 members of another family had been found dead under similar circumstances. The results, announced in August of 2013, were inconclusive, meaning no match was found, but the test could not definitively exclude them either. Capote's In Cold Blood, published in 1966 and researched over 6 years with the help of Harper Lee, remains the second best-selling true crime book in publishing history, behind only Helter Skelter. It essentially invented the genre that made every case on this list something millions of people would one day watch on a screen. That was 2 men acting alone, driven by greed and a bad tip. What happened in Chicago between 1981 and 1982 involved 4 men acting together, driven by something far darker, who operated in plain sight in one of America's largest cities for over a year before anyone connected the pattern. Robin Gecht. A 20-year-old woman named Beverly Washington was found on a Chicago roadside on October 6, 1982, alive but severely mutilated. She had been left for dead. When she was stable enough to speak, she gave investigators a description of the men who had attacked her and the vehicle they used. That description set off one of the most disturbing investigations in Chicago's history. So why did it take over a year for anyone to connect the pattern? The answer is that no one was looking for a pattern. Between 1981 and 1982, women in and around Chicago had been disappearing and turning up dead, many of them sex workers, many found with a specific and grotesque mutilation that investigators initially treated as unrelated incidents. It took Beverly Washington's survival to reveal that these were not isolated cases. They were the work of a group. The group consisted of 4 men. Robin Gecht, 28, was an electrician who had previously worked for John Wayne Gacy at PDM Contractors, a connection that would later fuel speculation about whether Gecht's exposure to Gacy played any role in what followed. Edward Spreitzer, 21, and brothers Andrew and Thomas Kokora-Leiss rounded out the crew. They operated out of Gecht's Chicago apartment, where investigators would later discover an attic converted into a makeshift chapel with inverted crosses. Survivors and co-defendants described rituals involving the Satanic Bible, and the crew's signature involved a specific and grotesque mutilation of the victims that was consistent across multiple cases. Confirmed victims included Linda Sutton, 28, found in Villa Park in May of 1981, Lorraine Borowski, 21, who disappeared from Elmhurst in May of 1982, Shui Mack, 30, Sandra Delaware, 18, Rose Davis, 30, Rafael Tirado, 28, the only male victim, who was shot in a drive-by in October of 1982, and Beverly Washington herself, who survived and became the prosecution's most critical witness. The total number of victims may have been as high as 17 or 18. though only a fraction were prosecuted due to the difficulty of linking physical evidence to specific defendants. The crew was arrested between October and November of 1982. The Kokoralais brothers and Spreitzer all confessed. Gecht never did. He maintained his innocence throughout, and because the physical evidence tying him specifically to any of the deaths was insufficient, he was never tried for a single one. Instead, Gecht was convicted in 1983 of the attempted murder, aggravated kidnapping, and assault of Beverly, Washington, and sentenced to 120 years. Edward Spreitzer pleaded guilty to multiple deaths in 1984 and received life without parole, with an additional death sentence in 1986 for the Linda Sutton case. That death sentence was commuted to life when Illinois Governor George Ryan issued a blanket commutation of all death sentences on January 11, 2003. Andrew Kokoralais was sentenced to death and was executed by lethal injection on March 17, 1999. He was the last person executed in the state of Illinois before the 2003 commutation and the state's eventual abolition of the death penalty in 2011. Thomas Kokoralais was convicted of Lorraine Borowski's death and originally sentenced to life. That conviction was overturned on appeal, and in 1987 he pleaded guilty and received a 70-year sentence. Under Illinois day-for-day rules, he served roughly half and was paroled on March 29, 2019. Having served approximately 32 years, his release prompted public outcry, particularly from the families of victims who argued that a man convicted in connection with a series of ritualistic attacks should never have been eligible for early release. As of 2024, he was reportedly living in Peoria, Illinois. As of 2025, Gecht and Spreitzer remain in Illinois prisons. Gecht has a projected parole date of October 10, 2042, when he would be 88 years old. Andrew Kokoralais is the only member of the group who was executed. In a separate development, Robin Gecht's son David was exonerated in 2022 of a 1999 wrongful conviction tied to a discredited Chicago police detective, and in 2024 settled a federal civil rights suit for $3.1 million. Beverly Washington's survival and her willingness to testify is the reason this case was solved at all. Without her, 4 men might have continued operating indefinitely in a city that was not looking for them. Jeffrey Dahmer. It was 1978, and Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old, living in Bath Township, Ohio, in a house that was falling apart in more ways than one. His parents had recently divorced. His mother had left. His father was away. He was alone. That was June of 1978. By July of 1991, 13 years later, he would be responsible for the deaths of 17 men and boys, making him one of the most documented serial offenders in American history. His first victim was Stephen Hicks, 18, a hitchhiker Dahmer picked up and brought home on June 18, 1978. He took Hicks's life and buried the remains on the property. After that, there was a gap of nearly 9 years before the next, Stephen Tuomi, 25, in 1987. From there, the frequency accelerated rapidly. Between 1987 and 1991, he took the lives of 16 more people. His victims were disproportionately young men of color, many of them from Milwaukee's gay community, and included individuals ranging from their teens to their early 30s. He lured them with offers of money for photographs, then drugged, strangled, and dismembered them. He retained skulls and other remains as trophies, and he consumed portions of several victims. From 1990 onward, he began attempting crude procedures on living victims, trying to create what he described as submissive, compliant individuals. The details of those procedures were presented at trial and remain among the most disturbing evidence ever entered into a Wisconsin courtroom. If that sounds bad, keep watching, because the most disturbing aspect of the Dahmer case is not the crimes themselves. It is how many times the system had an opportunity to stop him and did not. In May of 1991, a young victim managed to escape Dahmer's apartment at 924 North 25th Street in Milwaukee. The boy was found wandering the street, disoriented and unable to communicate clearly. 2 Milwaukee police officers responded, and Dahmer, calm and persuasive, convinced them the boy was his adult partner who had simply had too much to drink. The officers escorted the boy back into the apartment, noted a strange smell, and left. Dahmer took the boy's life that same night. The boy was 14 years old. The officers, John Balcerzak and Robert Gabrish, were fired over the incident, but later reinstated. Dahmer was finally arrested on July 22, 1991, after a man named Tracy Edwards escaped the apartment with a handcuff dangling from his wrist and flagged down 2 police officers. The search of apartment 213 uncovered 7 skulls, a human head in the refrigerator, hearts in the freezer, preserved remains in a 57-gallon drum of acid, and photographs documenting what had been done to the victims. His confession ran 178 pages over more than 60 hours of interrogation. Dahmer pleaded guilty but insane to 15 Wisconsin counts. On February 15, 1992, the jury rejected the insanity defense and found him sane. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years. Wisconsin did not have a death penalty. He later received a 16th life term in Ohio for the Stephen Hicks case. He was housed at Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. On the morning of November 28, 1994, while on a work detail cleaning the prison gymnasium, Dahmer was attacked by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver, who struck him with a 20-inch metal bar from the weight room. Dahmer died from his injuries. Another inmate, Jesse Anderson, was also attacked and died 2 days later. Scarver received 2 additional life sentences and remains incarcerated as of 2025 at Centennial Correctional Facility in Colorado. As of 2025, Dahmer has been dead for over 30 years. His father Lionel, who published a memoir called A Father's Story in 1994, died on December 5, 2023. His mother Joyce died of cancer on November 27, 2000. Christopher Scarver, the inmate who ended Dahmer's life, remains incarcerated at Centennial Correctional Facility in Colorado, where he is serving multiple life sentences. The case prompted significant reforms in how Milwaukee police responded to victims of color and members of the LGBT community, and the city has grappled with the legacy of the case ever since, including vocal opposition from victim families to the 2022 Netflix series that dramatized the crimes. The families have consistently asked that their loved ones be remembered as people, not as chapters in someone else's story. 10 cases, 10 different failures, whether it was a system that looked the other way, an investigation that took decades, or a sentence that never got carried out. The names in these cases belong to real people, and their families are still living with what happened. If any of these stories stay with you, that means you were paying attention. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.